Now, for a lot of us learning archery, it's very easy to look at someone who has a bit more experience, copy their confident form and process, and expect the same results. But of course, as we know, it isn't just about copying, it's also about understanding behind the scenes, the process involved in how they get the shot to work. And because of that, a lot of learners have a lot of inbuilt inconsistencies which cause problems later on. What we're going to focus on today is a pre-shot checklist. The things that most archers do subconsciously, but they get it consistently right. And for you to be conscious and aware of these steps so that your shooting becomes a lot more consistent. Now, when we do form checks, or when you ask someone to look at how you shoot, or you ask a coach to give you feedback, there are a few things which make us shake our heads, and this is one of them. So, disregarding how I'm shooting, might be a good shot, might be a bad shot, but there are certain really small habits which get really annoying to people who are trying to study you. And for those who are watching, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You're probably already shaking your heads. It's a bit of comic relief there. But there's something I'm doing which is really ruining the way I shoot. And this just illustrates the point of what I mean by a pre-shot checklist. Now, I didn't shoot that badly from a generic club bow, but I did a lot of things in between each shot which really ruined my consistency. Every time I shot, I moved. I had to walk around to fetch arrows, I had to come back, knock the arrow, stand again, shoot. And while in the back of your mind, you might think, well, I'm just doing the same thing each time. You're not. Every time I shuffle my feet, every time I turn around, every time I hold the bow again, it's changed. And I can't guarantee that every single shot I did was consistently the same. And that is the purpose of a pre-shot checklist. Now, there are different steps in checklists. I'm not here to prescribe one particular right one, and every training course, every training program will name things differently. Now, for example, I've got the Archery Australia 10 steps list here, which is the approved form we teach beginners, and it does outline several steps, things like stance and hook and grip and head alignment and so on. Some styles, like the KSL model, they don't really identify individual steps. It's one step called the set position. That's what I use when I teach pre-shot process, because the set position indicates that these things should be set. And that's really the theme I want to work with, whether you shoot KSL or not. For most archery technique, whether it's recurve or compound, traditional to a lesser extent, there are other ways to teach that, but a lot of the fundamentals of pre-shot involve setting things in position without having to move them. I'm going to go through what I show people when they start shooting to introduce them to having a pre-shot checklist, as well as some of the common faults which people change and become inconsistent between each shot. There are only a small number of items in this checklist, and it's fairly easy to remember. One way I've heard which people have taught is called head to toe. So you think head, shoulders, hands and feet. I prefer working from the ground up because the feet form the foundation of the shot and you go upwards with your head being the last thing. So either way, it's nice to remember to go through each level of your body so that you know that your body parts are in the right position before you start shooting. So the first step in our checklist is feet. There is no one correct way to stand, but there are common ways, and the most important thing is to make sure that you are positioning your feet consistently. Now, some people like being side on a square position where you're straddling the shooting line. Most people find it comfortable to open up slightly. This is the most common shooting position. Doesn't mean it's the only right way, but it's the most common way. The other thing to keep in mind is the weight distribution on your feet. So you do want to have a slightly forward lean. So you put more weight on the balls of your feet here. Many people lean backwards on their heels, which makes you off balance. You do want to have good contact with a bit more forward weight on the front of your feet, so you balance yourself over your line over here. Now, as we demonstrated earlier, feet tend to change quite often between shots because people will walk around to fetch arrows, or they might have a chat to the person next to them, and their feet shuffle around a lot. And again, the consequence is you never quite get the same foot position each time, and you mentally forget to do things like shift your weight or balance your feet correctly. And very often, and these are the most common mistakes, the angle of their feet changes. So different shots will have different feet position. Often the weight will change, so they might lean more on this side, lean more on that side. Quite often I see people who are starting will shoot, they'll lean very heavily on the front foot, so the back foot starts lifting away from the ground. And another thing is also the relative directions of the feet. So some people start normal like this, and then over time they start getting more and more duck footed like that. So it gets a little strange, but because they don't pay attention to this part of the checklist, every shot will gradually look more and more different, which again leads to a creep in poor shooting, poor form, poor balance, and the feet position form that foundation. You get this inconsistent, then every shot is inconsistent. Going up, we have hands. Now there are of course two hands that most people have: the hook on the string and the bow grip. Most people do pay attention to the string hook, so making sure that the string is on the same position on the fingers. Again, I'm not prescribing the one correct way. There are many different personal variations, but do pay attention to how you hook the string. Again, it's very easy to just subconsciously just put your hand on the string and not care about how it's balanced. This is very important because if it feels different and you don't realize it, your release will feel different. So looking at where your fingers on the string, actually looking with your eyes where your fingers are, that's quite important. But the thing which a lot of people don't do when they start off with is pay attention to the bow grip on this side. Now, the way that you do it with the recurve bows, whether it's the bear bow recurve or Olympic recurve, is to make sure you have more pressure on the flat part of the grip here, and you're putting it on the base of your thumb, the fleshy part here. So what's important is you have that V shape with your hand, and then you place it so that your thumb, the base of your thumb, is on that rest there. Now, the thing which drives me a little crazy is when I watch people shoot and haven't been taught the right grip, they'll often cradle the bow with their hands or fingers like this. So when they shoot, they end up holding the whole bow in what we call a death grip, lifting it up and shooting, and they end up carving their elbow up. And often it's because they never check their grip. Even when they've been taught the proper grip, because they're cradling the bow down here, they end up lifting it up and not moving the fingers. So it's important here in the set position to check that your grip is correct. Now you may want to put some pressure on the string, so you are holding the weight of the bow, otherwise you're cradling it and holding the weight with your bow hand, which makes it hard to adjust. So have the right grip here, put some pressure on the string, and when you lift the bow up, you lift it up together in one motion rather than changing your hand halfway through. You don't want to move your hand after this, hence why it's called set. Set your hand here, then lift the shot. Don't cradle it, then move your hand. That's not the right process. So set position here. Next we have the shoulders. Now the key of the shoulders is to keep them level. We don't want them to lift up when we draw. A lot of people lean backwards in the shot, or they rotate their shoulders over. So we don't want shoulder movement. Okay, this is one of the hardest things to get right when you're first starting out because you don't know how to move your shoulders. So it does take time to understand where your shoulders should be. So a good reference point is to stand straight, you breathe in, and you breathe out. And that shoulder level is where your shoulders should be when you shoot a bow. So we'll get our bow here and we'll demonstrate. So we have our feet position, we've checked our fingers and our bow grip and the right position. And now, before we address the target, we pay attention to our shoulders. So again, and that position is where it should be. So when I do lift the bow, I'm not going to exceed that level even when I draw back. So that's one way to help me remember to keep my shoulders at the right level. Otherwise, you'll see people lean back, lean forward. You want to keep shoulders level. And the last step, which we'll do here as well, is head. So we've got feet, hands, shoulder, head. Again, the key thing is the head should not move. So you address the target. I often tell people to stare down a bit, so look down, because a lot of people do this. They will inevitably tilt their head up and then look down. You don't want any movement between the shot. Set position means head is set in position. It takes time to get used to knowing where your head should be, but knowing how to address it. Tilt your head down a bit, so when you draw to your anchor. You don't move your anchor to your string, right? So again, many people go, what you should be doing is head down, set, draw, then release. And you'll see in between shots, there's virtually no head movement. That's a sign you're doing it right. So let's go through a couple more shots, going through our checklist. So making sure that we're happy with our feet position and we feel the weight, especially near the toes. We then make sure, we have got our arrow knocked of course. We then make sure that we check our string position on the fingers, as well as have the bow grip right. Put some weight on, so we have the correct bow grip here. Check my shoulder level, check my head position, and then go through the shot. And ideally, between shots, I don't move. If I have an arrow on a quiver in my pocket somewhere, I'll just retrieve the arrow and not have to walk around and move my feet. So the feet stay still. Even so, check that our feet are good. Check our string position, our bow grip, shoulders, head, and then shoot. And when you're shooting your 3 arrows or your 6 arrows, you'll notice that there's very little movement between each shot. That's a good thing. So we do the same thing, side view, just focusing on the upper body, but you see again how little movement there is between shots. So go to each of steps, check our weight, check our fingers, bow grip, shoulders, head. And then second shot, we do the same thing. So knock the arrow, check stance, feet, fingers, shoulders, head. And then last shot, same thing, check, check, check. And you compare those shots, again, virtually no movement. And those weren't great shots. I didn't anchor very tightly, I rushed my shots, I collapsed. I wasn't trying to demonstrate perfect shooting. I was trying to demonstrate consistent checklisting. That's a word now. So you go through each checklist, and most good archers will go through this checklist. A lot of them will compartmentalize this as a subconscious thing. But most people, when they get used to shooting, will remember to check these things every single time. And you'll find all these weird mannerisms, shuffling the feet, moving the fingers, all these things to help remember how to go through each shot. Because if each shot is slightly different, then every arrow is going to be slightly different. But it's also a much more sinister problem, which will develop over the long term. And that is the creep of bad form and bad technique that is so gradual that archers don't realize it. And it takes someone else watching them to realize, oh, hold up, what are you doing there now? Because again, when you don't pay attention to your checklist, then your hand starts to move. And over the course of a week or 2 weeks, you don't realize that your hand shifted position completely. The angles change, the fingers are closing on the grip. And I've definitely worked with people who develop some strange habits almost overnight. And they've never realized that their hands moved or their stance has closed, or the stance has opened, and you ask them why, and they can't explain why. It's just subconscious. So that's the reason why we go through a pre-shot checklist. Again, each process and each coaching method will go through a different set of steps. The most important thing for those who are learning, even those who are shooting competitively, say Olympic recurve or trad recurve, is do pay attention to these things. Don't just put it in the back of your mind and go, oh, it's the same every single time. Now that may be okay for casual shooting, but for target shooting, where points matter, you want to be as consistent as possible. That means as much as possible, check that your grip, your stance, your head position are as still as possible or as consistent as possible. Because if you assume that it's consistent, well, you'd be surprised the next time your coach sees you, they'll point at you and go, what's that? Anyway, I hope that helps. I'm curious for those who do shoot, what are your steps when you go through your shot process? How do you make sure that you have all the right things in place? Do post your comments below. I do hope it helps. I know people should competitively make these mistakes, but a lot of learners will run through this brick wall and wonder why the shots don't work. And I do hope that this provides some structure to your shot process. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Do stay safe, and I'll see you next time.